Formative assessment process and characteristics. The formative assessment process is a deliberate process used by teachers and students during instruction that provides actionable feedback that is used to adjust ongoing teaching and learning strategies to improve students' attainment of curricular learning targets goals. Formative assessment cycle: clarify intended learning, 2. Elicit evidence, 3. Act on evidence, interpret evidence, 3. Interpret evidence, 4. Act on evidence. Number 1. Clarify. Clarify means determine learning goals. What students will know by the end of the lesson. The goals describe big ideas or concepts and reflect academic standards. Learning goals are written in student-friendly language, beginning with "I understand." Establish success criteria. The evidence that teachers and students use to determine how students are progressing toward the learning goals. They are also written in student-friendly language, beginning with "I can." Elicit. 2. Elicit means engage in a learning event or activity that prompts and generates evidence of learning. Evidence should be tightly aligned to the learning goals and guided by success criteria. Consider student needs, interests, and learning styles when deciding how to elicit evidence so that students can demonstrate their understanding in different ways to meet the success criteria. Use multiple sources of evidence to draw accurate conclusions about student learning. 3. Interpret. Interpret means review the evidence to determine students' progress toward learning goals and success criteria. Interpreting is about analyzing evidence of learning and identifying the gap between where students are and where they need to be. Students can analyze evidence of their own learning and discuss their interpretations with teachers and peers. Interpreting evidence is not a single event but part of an ongoing process throughout instruction. 4. Act. Teachers determine and initiate appropriate instructional next steps. These may not be the same for all students and must take into consideration each student's readiness, interests, and learning preferences. Students receive feedback that is specific about what they need to do next in the learning process. Characteristics of formative assessment. 5 attributes of formative assessment. Note: teachers should strive to use all 5 attributes in their formative assessments. Number 1. Learning progressions. Learning progressions should clearly articulate the sub-goals of the ultimate learning goal. Learning progressions describe how concepts and skills build in a domain and show the trajectory of learning along which students are expected to progress. From a learning progression, teachers have the big picture of what students need to learn, as well as sufficient detail for planning instruction to meet short-term goals. They are able to connect formative assessment opportunities to the short-term goals to keep track of how well their students' learning is moving forward. For example, at the earlier stages of a progression for historical inquiry, students must learn how to investigate the past from a range of sources of information, e.g., stories, eyewitness accounts, pictures, photographs, artifacts, historic buildings, museums, galleries, and technology-based sources. Students build on this learning in later stages of the progression to develop an understanding that people represent and interpret the past in different ways, e.g., through pictures, plays, films, reconstructions, museum displays, and fiction and non-fiction accounts, and that the interpretations reflect the intentions of those who make them, e.g., writers, archaeologists, historians, and filmmakers. A goal for students at each level of the progression would be to investigate a set of artifacts in increasingly sophisticated ways to extract information about a particular period or event in history. Not only would such investigations support the students' development of historical reasoning, they would also provide evidence of the students' ability to reason in increasingly complex ways. This involves moving from the early stages of reasoning based on simple observation to the more complex stages based on indirect observation and the synthesis of multiple sources of information. Using the evidence elicited from such tasks connected to the goals of the progression, a teacher could identify the just right gap, a growth point in learning that involves a step that is neither too large nor too small, and makes adjustment to instruction accordingly. Number 2. Learning goals and criteria for success. Learning goals and criteria for success should be clearly identified and communicated to students, because the formative assessment process helps students achieve intended learning outcomes based on explicit learning progressions. Teachers must first identify and then communicate the instructional goal to students. In addition to communicating the nature of the instructional goal, teachers must provide the criteria by which learning will be assessed so that students will know whether they are successfully progressing toward the goal. This information should be communicated using language readily understood by students, and may be accompanied by realistic examples of those that meet and do not meet the criteria. For example, suppose the goal of a social studies instructional unit was to have students prepare a written critique of the quality of arguments in political essays in a local newspaper's editorial pages. The teacher might first offer students a paraphrased version of that goal, such as, "You will be able to judge the strengths and weaknesses of arguments in the editorials you find in our daily newspapers." The teacher would discuss the criteria for evaluating arguments and then provide several examples of critiques of political essays. This will provide students with a reasonably clear idea of the analytic skills they are to develop, and also provide them with the tools required to assess their own written analysis. 3. Descriptive feedback. Students should be provided with evidence-based feedback that is linked to the intended instructional outcomes and criteria for success. Descriptive feedback should be about the particular qualities of student learning, with discussion or suggestions about what the student can do to improve. It should avoid comparisons with other pupils. Specific Specific timely feedback should be based on the learning goal and criteria for success. It should help the student answer three basic questions. Where am I going? Where am I now? How can I close the gap? For example, in an 8th grade writing class, the students are learning how to construct an argument. They are focusing specifically on speech writing and have examined several effective speeches both from prominent speech makers in history and from previous years' 8th grade students. In this particular lesson, students have been asked to write an opening paragraph to their speech with the success criteria of introducing their topic in a way that engages the audience. The feedback the teacher gives to one student is: the opening paragraph does not capture the audience's attention because it does not clearly state what the speech is about. However, the opening sentence of the second paragraph states your position with an effective contrast. What can you do to improve or strengthen your opening paragraph? With this kind of descriptive feedback and collaboration, the teacher clarifies the goal for the student, provides specific information about where the student is in relation to meeting the criteria, and offers enough substantive information to allow the student an opportunity to identify ways to move learning forward. Similarly, in a 6th grade math class, students working in groups have been asked to review an example of the steps a student from a previous year took to solve a problem. They must decide if the work is correct or incorrect and provide an explanation for their view. The success criterion that the teacher gives them is: include any properties or rules that may apply in your explanation. When the groups report back after their discussions, the teacher listens for the rules or properties in the explanations, and this becomes the focus of her feedback. To one group she says, your explanation shows me that you understand that the steps the student took to solve the problem were incorrect. Remember the success criterion. You must also relate your explanation to one of the properties we have been discussing in class to indicate the reason the steps were incorrect. Again, the students know the goal where their response differed from the criteria and how they can improve their explanations. 4. Self and peer assessment. Both self and peer assessment are important for providing students an opportunity to think metacognitively about their learning. Formative assessment is a process that directly engages both teachers and students. In addition to teacher feedback, when students and their peers are involved, there are many more opportunities to share and receive feedback. Helping students think metacognitively about their own learning fosters the idea that learning is their responsibility and that they can take an active role in planning, monitoring, and evaluating their own progress. To support both self and peer assessment, the teacher must provide structure and support so students learn to be reflective of their own work and that of their peers, allowing them to provide meaningful and constructive feedback. In self assessment, students reflect on and monitor their learning using clearly explicated criteria for success. In peer assessment, students analyze each other's work using guidelines or rubrics and provide descriptive feedback that supports continued improvement. For example, students can work in peers to review each other's work to give feedback. A teacher needs to have modeled good feedback with students and talked about what acceptable and unacceptable comments look like in order to have created a safe learning environment. Students can use a rubric to provide feedback to a peer by articulating reasons why a piece of work is at one level and discussing how it could be improved to move it to the next level. Alternatively, feedback could be given using a format such as 2 stars and a wish, which provides a structure for a student to identify two aspects of the work that are particularly strong stars, and one aspect the peer might improve a wish. Students then need time to reflect on the feedback they have received to make changes or improvements. In addition, students can be encouraged to be self-reflective by thinking about their own work based on what they learn from giving feedback to others. A further benefit of providing feedback to a peer is that it can help deepen the student's own learning. However, student and peer assessment should not be used in the formal grading process. 5. Collaboration. A classroom culture in which teachers and students are partners in learning should be established. Sharing learning goals and criteria for success with students, supporting students as they monitor and take responsibility for their own learning, helping students to provide constructive feedback to each other, and involving students in decisions about how to move learning forward are illustrations of students and teachers working together in the teaching and learning process. However, for students to be actively and successfully involved in their own learning, they must feel that they are bona fide partners in the learning process. This feeling is dependent on a classroom culture characterized by a sense of trust between and among students and their teachers, by norms of respect, transparency, and appreciation of differences, and by a non-threatening environment. Creating such a culture requires teachers to model these behavior during interactions with students, to actively teach the classroom norms, and to build the students' skills in constructive self and peer assessment. In this type of classroom culture, students will more likely feel they are collaborators with their teachers and peers in the learning process.